The canal lies still in the early morning, a ribbon of dark water that mirrors the stepped gables and the red brick facades of the houses leaning close together along the quay. There is no wind yet, only the cool breath of the low country moving gently through the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint scent of damp stone and the yeasty warmth from the brewery farther along the water. A water gate at the far end of the canal creaks as it is lifted, the sound a low, drawn-out groan of old timber and iron that rolls across the surface and fades into the lapping of water against the stone embankment. Beyond the gate, a single barge is poled slowly forward by a man who stands at the stern, and the sway of his pole makes no splash, just a quiet dipping that belongs to the rhythm of the place. The town is waking without haste. A cow lows once from a byre tucked behind a merchant's house, and a shutter is pushed open on an upper floor, letting a sliver of candlelight escape into the grey air before it is blown out. The cobbles, worn smooth by decades of wooden clogs and iron cartwheels, hold the memory of rain from the night before in shallow puddles that tremble as a cart passes in the next street. Everything is close, orderly and quiet, the streets running along the water-like veins and the bridges arching over them in steady stone curves that have not changed in 100 years. On the third bridge from the Watergate, the small factory stands at the edge of the canal with its loading door level with the water. It is a modest building, no different from its neighbours to the casual eye, built of the same brownish brick and roofed in dark tiles that slope sharply to shed the frequent rain. Over the door, a simple wooden beam is carved with the outline of a wheat sheaf, nearly worn away by weather. Inside, the workshop is still and cool, the windows of imperfect greenish glass admitting a muffled light that turns the air into a soft green-grey wash. The shapes of oak barrels, broad and silent, sit in rows along one wall, their hoops dark with age. A great millstone rests on a flat bed of granite near the back door that leads to the stable, and copper basins gleam faintly on a long bench where linen cloths hang from pegs, motionless. Up a narrow staircase whose treads are scooped by the weight of countless footsteps, the starch maker stirs in his sleeping room under the eaves. He opens his eyes to the same rafter he has seen every morning for 20 years. A rough-hewn beam of pine, with a small knot shaped like a bird in profile. He lies still for a moment, watching the grey light grow, and then he rises without a sound apart from the soft rustle of a thin blanket. His movements are slow, not from age or tiredness, but from the habit of a life that has never been in a hurry. He washes his face and hands in a basin of cold water drawn the night before from the cistern below, the chill of it tightening the skin on his knuckles. The washcloth he uses is undyed linen, the same as the bags that will later hold his finished starch, and he hangs it on the peg to dry in the scentless air. He dresses in the quiet dark of the room. First, a shirt of plain cream-coloured linen falls over his head, the cuffs tied with a short cord that dangles between his wrists. Over this he pulls a woolen doublet of dark brown, its buttons made of polished bone that slick through their loops with the ease of long use. His breeches are heavy wool, also dark, and he ties them at the knee before sitting on the edge of the bed to pull on his stockings and his soft leather shoes that have no heel. Each action follows the last in a sequence as fixed as the path of the canal outside, and when he stands fully dressed, he pauses to look once around the room that holds nothing but a bed, a chair, a washstand, and a small wooden chest with an iron lock. There is no looking-glass. He knows what he looks like only from the reflections the canal sometimes gives back, a calm face with deep-set eyes and a close-trimmed beard that is beginning to show threads of grey. He descends the stairs, his hand resting lightly on the warm banister, and the scents of the workshop rise to meet him. It is a smell made of damp grain, the clean sharpness of settled starch, and the faint trace of wood smoke from the small hearth that is kept lit only in the deepest winter months. At the foot of the stairs he pauses to take in the familiar sight, the quiet forms of the barrels, the settling vats in the next room visible through an open doorway, the great millstone at rest. A shallow tin lantern hangs from a beam, its flame long extinguished, and he does not light it now, because the morning light is enough for the first tasks, enough to see the shape of the day ahead, the same as it always is, and the thought brings a quiet comfort that rests in the chest like a slow breath exhaled. Outside, the town bell begins its first toll of the day, a deep note that rolls across the rooftops and sends a ripple across the canal. The starch maker opens the lower half of the stable door and looks into the small yard where the draft horse is already standing, a patient gelding with feathered hooves and a coat the color of dried clay. The horse turns its head and blows a soft breath through its nostrils, and the starch maker places a hand on its warm neck for a moment before returning inside. The day has begun without any announcement, just the quiet creak of a water gate, the lowing of a cow, and the first light settling over a small Dutch town where a man will soon turn wheat into the fine white powder that will hold a collar stiff and proud around a burgher's neck. The morning deepens by small measures as the last note of the town bell fades into the low cloud that sits over the rooftops, and the canal begins to show the first movements of the working day. A shutter opens on the house opposite the factory, and a woman shakes a cloth over the sill, the small cloud of dust catching the light before it drifts down to the water. Further along, a child runs along the cobbles with a loaf of bread clutched to her chest, her wooden clogs making a light clatter that echoes briefly and then stops when she turns a corner. The starch maker stands at the open loading door of his factory, the lower half swung wide and the upper half still latched, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he watches the bend in the canal where the barge will appear. The loading door is set flush with the water, the stone threshold warmed smooth by the rubbing of countless hulls that have nudged against it over the years. 2 iron rings are set into the brick on either side, and a short length of rope hangs from one, its end neatly coiled and ready. Below the threshold, the water of the canal laps against the stone with a soft, persistent sound that never entirely stops, a liquid whisper that has been the background noise of the factory since the first brick was laid. The tide is neither high nor low, just a middling level that keeps the barge deck at the perfect height for unloading. From around the bend comes the slow prow of a flat-bottomed barge, its hull painted a faded green, and its deck piled with sacks that make a low hill amidships. The bargee stands at the stern with his long pole, a man of middle years with a leather cap pulled low and a woolen scarf looped around his neck, though the morning is not cold enough to need it. He navigates the narrow canal with the ease of someone who has done this run 1,000 times, dipping the pole into the dark water and pushing off from the muddy bottom without ever striking the stone walls. The barge moves at the pace of a slow walk, and the starch maker watches it come nearer without any impatience, noting the way the water bulges at the bow and then falls away in 2 smooth ripples that spread outward to lap against the quay. When the barge reaches the loading door, the bargee lifts his pole out of the water and lets it slide through his hands until it rests upright in a socket on the deck. He steps forward to the bow and tosses a thin rope to the starch maker, who catches it with one hand and loops it around the iron ring with a quick half hitch that he ties without looking. The barge settles against the threshold with a gentle bump that is more felt than heard, a soft vibration through the stone that travels up the starch maker's legs and into the soles of his feet. The bargee nods once, a greeting that requires no words, and the starch maker nods back before turning to the sacks. There are 12 sacks this morning, each one a rough burlap weight of wheat that stands as high as a man's knee and as wide as a barrel hoop. The stalks were cut from the heavy clay soils of the Low Countries, fields that stretch flat to the horizon where the windmills turn slowly on the far dike. The grain inside is winter wheat, planted in the cold months and harvested in the short hot weeks of high summer, and it has been threshed and winnowed and poured into these sacks that still smell faintly of the dusty sweetness of the granary. The starch maker bends and takes hold of the first sack by its 2 corners, the coarse cloth ruff against his palms, and he lifts it with a steady pull that brings it onto the stone threshold with a soft, dense thud. He does not drag the sacks or let them fall hard. Each one is settled into place inside the dry store just beyond the loading area, a room with a raised wooden floor that keeps the grain off the damp stone. The floorboards have been scrubbed pale and smooth, and the sacks arranged in a neat row against the wall, their rounded shapes touching each other like sleeping animals. The starch maker moves back and forth from the barge to the store, his steps unhurried but steady, and the pile on the deck grows smaller while the row inside grows longer. The bargee waits by his pole, and after a while he finds a dry crust of bread in a pocket and eats it slowly, watching the ripples on the canal. When the last sack is carried inside, the starch maker pauses to look at the wheat. He kneels beside one sack and presses his fingers into the coarse cloth, feeling the shape of the grains beneath, their plumpness and their firmness. Through the burlap he can sense the slight give of the wheat, the way the individual kernels shift against each other like fine sand in a leather pouch, and he knows from this touch that the grain is dry and sound, not musty from a wet harvest nor shriveled from a dry season. He presses a second sack to be sure, finding the same good weight and the same clean resistance, and then he stands and brushes a trace of burlap dust from the front of his doublet. He takes a stub of chalk from a niche in the wall, a piece of white river chalk that leaves a dry, dusty mark on his fingers, and he makes a single tally mark on the inside of the doorframe. There are other marks there already, vertical lines scratched in groups of 5, the record of deliveries going back to the start of the year when the winter ice had only just melted from the canal. The chalk mark joins the others, a small white line that will fade over the weeks as the air wears at it, and eventually it will be gone and a new year will bring new marks. The starch maker returns the chalk to its niche and brushes his hands together twice, a faint puff of white rising briefly before disappearing. Outside, the bargee has untied the rope and is already pushing off from the threshold, his pole dipping into the water and the barge gliding backward into the canal. The starch maker lifts a hand and the bargee lifts his cap in return, a small gesture that is the same every morning. The barge moves off past the brewery, past the cooper's yard where barrels are stacked in pyramids, past the narrow house with the blue door where a cat sits on the step, and it rounds a bend by the old way house and is gone from sight. The water closes behind it, the ripples smoothing out until the canal is a dark mirror again, and the starch maker stands for a moment in the doorway, feeling the cool air on his face and hearing the distant sound of a hammer from the shipyard beyond the town wall. He turns back into the factory and walks to the dry store where the sacks now stand in their row, 12 shapes of rough burlap that hold the beginning of the week's work. The light from the small window falls across the top of the sacks, showing the faint dust of the granary that still clings to the fibers, a soft bloom of pale grey that glimmers when he moves past. In the stillness of the store, the air is cooler than outside, and there is a smell here that is different from the rest of the factory, a dry, nutty scent of raw grain that promises the long, slow transformations to come. The starch maker counts the sacks again, not because he has forgotten, but because the act of counting is part of the rhythm, a small check that marks the boundary between the receiving and the steeping. He touches each sack as he counts, a light tap of his knuckle on the burlap, and the number settles in his mind with the solidity of a fact that need not be written down. 12 sacks of winter wheat from the clay fields. 12 units of work that will move through the barrels and the mill and the settling vats and the drying loft until they emerge as a fine white powder as light as the dust on the chalk. He lifts the lid of the steeping barrel that stands nearest the door, and he looks inside at the clean water that was drawn from the cistern yesterday and left to settle overnight, so that any grit or stray matter would sink to the bottom. The water is clear and still, a dark circle that reflects the rafters above, and he lets the lid fall back into place with a soft plap of oak on oak. The barrel is ready. The grain is ready. The morning has moved from its beginning to its middle, without any rush or sound louder than the thud of a sack on stone, and the starch maker goes to the bucket to draw fresh water for the first steep, his shoes making no noise on the scrubbed floorboards. The steeping room lies at the heart of the factory, a long and low-ceiling space that runs from the dry store to the outer wall where the millstone stands in its courtyard. It is a room that never sees the full light of day, for the windows here are set high under the eaves and are smaller than a man's hand, glazed with the same greenish glass that turns the morning into a dusky underwater glow. The air in this room is cooler than the air outside and always carries a faint, clean scent of damp grain, a smell that has soaked into the wooden walls over so many years that it rises from the planks even when the barrels stand empty. The floor is made of broad flagstones, uneven and dark with age, and they hold the chill of the earth beneath them, a coolness that passes through the soles of the starch maker's shoes as he moves among the barrels. There are 6 barrels in the steeping room, each one made of oak staves bound with iron hoops that have been blackened by time and the occasional rub of a damp hand. They are not all the same size, for they were built by different coopers in different years, but each one stands as high as a man's waist and is wide enough that a grown man could not wrap his arms around it and touch his fingers together. The lids are heavy circles of oak with a small iron ring set in the center, and they fit snugly into the tops of the barrels, resting on a lip that has been planed smooth. Beside each barrel, a long wooden paddle leans against the wall, its blade worn thin at the edges from years of stirring, its handle polished to a dull gleam by the grip of the starch maker's hand. The starch maker begins with the barrel nearest the door, the one he looked into earlier when the barge was still unloading. He lifts the lid and sets it aside against the wall, and the water inside is still and clear, a dark circle that smells faintly of the canal, but cleaner, having sat through the night in the settling cistern so that any mud or fine sand might drift to the bottom. He takes a flat wooden scoop from a hook on the wall and lowers it into the water, skimming the surface with a slow, careful motion that lifts away a few specks of dust and a single tiny fly that must have found its way in through the shutters. The water trembles slightly and then settles back into stillness, and the starch maker nods to himself before turning to the dry store. He returns with the first sack of wheat, and he unties the rough knot at its neck, the burlap crackling softly as it loosens. The smell of the grain rises up, dry and nutty, and he tips the sack carefully so that the wheat flows out in a steady golden stream into the waiting water. The grains sink at once, slipping down through the dark column with a whisper of displaced water, a sound like rain falling on a distant roof, and the level of the barrel rises by the width of 2 fingers. He pours until the sack is empty, and then he shakes the burlap once, twice, to loosen any grains that cling to the fibers, and a final small scatter of wheat falls into the barrel and disappears. The empty sack is folded and laid on a pile near the door, where it will later be returned to the barge to be filled again in the next season. The starch maker takes the wooden paddle from its place against the wall and lowers the blade into the barrel, pushing it down through the water until it touches the layer of grain at the bottom. He stirs slowly, a steady circular motion that moves the wheat without splashing, turning the grains over and over so that everyone is wetted and the chaff that still clings to some of the kernels loosens and floats upward. The paddle moves through the water with a low rhythmic sound, a soft slosh that is the loudest noise in the room, but still no louder than a quiet conversation. As he stirs, the water changes, its clarity giving way to a faint, dusty haze that swirls for a moment and then begins to settle. Small bits of chaff, pale and feathery, rise to the surface and drift there like tiny boats. He lifts the paddle out and leans it against the barrel, water dripping from the blade in slow, heavy drops that darken the flagstone for a moment before blending back into the general damp of the floor. From the hook on the wall he takes a flat sieve, a shallow frame of wood with a bottom of fine brass mesh, and he skims it across the surface of the water, scooping up the floating chaff with a gentle, sweeping motion that disturbs nothing below. The chaff collects in the mesh as a pale, fibrous mat, and he taps the sieve against the rim of a wooden bucket to empty it before skimming again, repeating the motion until the surface of the barrel is as clear as it was before the grain was added. The bucket of chaff will later be carried out to the stable yard, where it will be scattered for the hens that scratch in the dust behind the stable, and they will peck at it and find the small seeds that the sieve could not separate from the wheat. The lid is lowered back onto the barrel, and the starch maker moves to the second barrel, where the same sequence repeats. The lid lifted, the water checked, the grain poured in a steady stream, the paddle stirring slowly, the sieve skimming the floating chaff. The lid settled back into place. He moves from barrel to barrel without haste, and the work is a quiet rhythm that fills the room with a calm, measured purpose. The light from the high windows shifts almost imperceptibly as the morning progresses, the greenish glow moving across the flagstones by the width of a thumb, and the only sounds are the soft slosh of the paddle, the tap of the sieve on the bucket rim, and the creak of the oak lids settling into place. When all 6 barrels have been filled and skimmed, the starch maker pauses in the center of the room and wipes his hands on a scrap of linen that hangs from his belt. He looks at the barrels with a quiet satisfaction that does not show on his face but rests somewhere deeper, a calm awareness that the first step is done. The wheat is now under water, the grains softening and swelling in the cool dark, and the gluten that holds the starch tightly inside each kernel is beginning to loosen, a slow chemical process that requires nothing more than time and the patient soaking of the water. There is no fire to be lit, no lever to be pulled, no clock to be watched. The steeping will take its own course, as it always does, and the starch maker's only task now is to wait and to observe. He leaves the steeping room and goes about other small duties in the factory for a time, sweeping the loading area where a few grains of wheat have scattered on the stone, checking the linen sieves that hang on their wooden frames in the washing room, rubbing a spot of rust from the rim of a copper basin with a scrap of wool cloth. These tasks fill the hours with a quiet, undemanding busyness, and every so often he returns to the steeping room and lifts the lid of the first barrel to peer inside. The water is no longer clear. It has taken on a faint, milky hue, a cloudiness that drifts in slow, barely perceptible currents when he looks closely. The smell has changed too, no longer just the clean damp of grain and water, but now carrying a slight sweetness, an earthy scent that reminds him of bread dough left too long on the kneading board, a smell that is not unpleasant, but rather rich and full of the promise of transformation. By the end of the second day, the change is more pronounced. The water in the barrels is now distinctly opaque, a pale, creamy white that hides the grain completely from view. And as the starch maker dips his fingers into the barrel and feels for the wheat, he finds the kernels softened and plump. The skins loosened and starting to slip. The smell has deepened too, no longer just a faint sweetness, but a fuller, slightly sour tang that fills the steeping room with a presence that is almost alive. A quiet fermentation that is the work of invisible organisms changing the grain from within. The starch maker knows this smell well, and he knows the exact degree of sourness that marks the right moment for the steeping to end. Too short, and the gluten will not separate plainly from the starch. Too long, and the grain will sour too much, giving the final starch a yellowish tinge that no laundress in the town would accept for a burgher's ruff. On the third morning after the steeping began, the starch maker lifts the lid of the first barrel and knows that the time has come. The smell that rises is full and round, a sourness that is clean rather than foul, like the smell of a cellar where cider has been kept through the winter. The water is thick and milky, and when he dips his hand into it and brings up a small handful of the grain, the softened kernels squeeze easily between his fingers, releasing a pale, starchy paste that clings to his skin. He rubs the paste between thumb and forefinger, feeling its texture, noting how the gluten has begun to gather into small, stringy clumps that can be felt as separate from the smooth, silky starch. He nods once, and he replaces the lid, and he goes to fetch the pails for the next stage of the work. The steeping room, when the barrels are ready, becomes a place of quiet activity as the starch maker ladles the softened grain out of the barrels and into wooden pails. He uses a wide, shallow scoop made of beechwood, dipping it into the barrel and lifting out the grain with a slow, careful motion that brings as little water with it as possible. The grain is loaded into the pails, each one holding about 2 scoops, and the pails are carried 2 at a time to the room where the millstone waits. The walk from the steeping room to the mill is short, no more than 20 steps across the courtyard, but it is made many times over the course of the morning, and by the time the first barrel is empty, the starch maker's arms have begun to feel the familiar, dull ache that comes from the repetition of lifting and carrying. The barrels are not emptied all at once. The starch maker works through them one by one over the course of the day, beginning with the first barrel that was filled and ending with the last, so that each batch of grain has soaked for exactly the same amount of time. The water that remains in the bottom of each barrel, thick with dissolved starch and the byproducts of the fermentation, is not thrown away, but poured carefully into a separate tub, for it contains starch that has already begun to settle out of solution, and can be added to the washing water later in the process to recapture what would otherwise be lost. Nothing is wasted in the small factory, not the chaff, not the steep water, not the gluten that will be scraped from the sieves and sent to the baker. When the last barrel has been emptied and the last pail of softened grain has been carried to the mill room, the starch maker returns to the steeping room and begins the work of cleaning. He takes a bucket of fresh water and a stiff brush, and he scrubs the inside of each barrel with long, even strokes that follow the curve of the staves. The sour residue clings to the wood at first, but the brush works it loose, and a rinse of clean water leaves the oak smelling fresh and faintly of the canal again, ready for the next steeping when the next delivery of wheat arrives. The lids are left off so that the barrels can dry, and the starch maker hangs his brush on its hook and stands for a moment in the doorway of the steeping room, looking at the 6 open barrels standing in the dim greenish light. The air still holds the ghost of the fermentation, a faint clean sourness that will fade by morning when the shutters are opened and the breeze from the canal passes through. The steeping is done, and the wheat has become something new. A softened, plump grain, ready to give up its starch to the turning of the great stone wheel. The mill room is a space that belongs as much to the stable yard as to the factory, a covered passageway open at both ends, where the air moves freely and carries with it the smell of hay and the distant sound of the canal. The roof here is lower than in the steeping room, the tiles set on a gentle slope that sheds rain into a stone channel at the side, and the floor is made of the same worn flagstones that run through the rest of the building, though here they are grooved by the passage of the horses' hooves over many years, shallow tracks that lead in an unbroken circle around the central stone. The walls are whitewashed brick, plain and unadorned, and they rise to the height of a man's shoulder before giving way to the open air above, so that the mill room is never entirely enclosed, but always feels the nearness of the sky and the damp breath of the low country. In the center of the room stands the edge runner mill, a great flat bed of granite that is as wide across as a dining table and as thick as a man's forearm, supported on a low plinth of brick that raises it just above the level of the floor. The stone is grey with a faint pinkish fleck, and its surface has been worn smooth by the grinding of countless batches of grain, polished to a dull sheen that catches the light in a soft, diffused glow. On this bed rests the runner stone, a vertical wheel of the same granite, as tall as a man's waist and as thick as a barrel stave, set on its edge so that it rolls around the bed in a continuous circle. The wheel is mounted on a horizontal axle of oak that passes through its center and connects to a vertical shaft of iron-bound timber that rises through a hole in the roof to the turning beam above. The whole mechanism is simple and ancient, a design that would be recognized by a miller in Roman times or in a village on the far side of the world, and it has been turning in this room since the factory was built. The horse is brought in from the stable yard through the wide door that faces the canal, led by the starch maker with a hand resting lightly on the bridle. The gelding is a calm animal, deep-chested and broad in the haunch, with a coat the colour of dried river clay and a mane that falls in a shaggy line along his neck. His hooves are feathered with long hair that brushes the flagstones as he walks, and his eyes are dark and placid, watching the world with the patience of a creature that has done this same work for most of his life and expects nothing different from this day. He is not young, for the work of turning the mill is slow and steady, and suits an older horse that has learned to pace itself, and the starch maker has known him for 10 years now, since the horse was a young gelding bought from a farm near Leiden, where the fields run flat to the dunes. The starch maker leads the horse to the wooden shaft that extends outward from the vertical turning beam, a heavy bulk of oak that has been planed smooth and fitted with an iron swivel at the end. The horse's harness is a simple arrangement of broad leather straps that pass across his chest and over his back, padded with felt where they touch the skin, and they are buckled in place with brass fittings that have been polished by years of handling until they glow a dull gold in the morning light. The starch maker fastens the harness to the swivel with a wooden pin that slides into place with a soft click, and he checks each strap with a quick, practiced hand, running his fingers under the leather to be sure that nothing pinches or rubs. The horse stands perfectly still during this process, his head dropping slightly, his lower lip loose and relaxed, and he blows a long, quiet breath through his nostrils that stirs the dust on the flagstone at his feet. When the harness is secure, the starch maker moves to the mill bed and begins to arrange the softened grain. The pails of steeped wheat stand in a row against the wall, their contents pale and swollen, dripping with the milky water of the steeping room. The starch maker takes a wooden scoop and spreads the grain in a thick, even ring on the flat stone bed, piling it no higher than the width of 2 fingers, so that the runner wheel will crush it evenly as it rolls. The grain lies on the stone in a pale, lumpy circle, glistening faintly, and the scent of the sour fermentation rises from it, a clean, bready smell that mixes with the hay sweetness of the horse and the cool air from the canal. The starch maker steps back from the stone and looks over the arrangement with a slow, assessing gaze, and then he moves to the horse and takes the bridle in one hand. He makes a soft clicking sound with his tongue, and the horse steps forward. The motion is slow at first, the great shoulder muscles bunching and releasing under the glossy coat, the iron-shod hooves lifting and falling with a measured, heavy rhythm. The vertical shaft begins to turn, a deep wooden groaning sounding through the roof as the axle rotates in its greased bearing, and the runner stone stirs on its bed and begins to roll. The first pass of the wheel over the grain makes a sound that is part crush and part grind, a low, wet cracking that is the sound of thousands of wheat kernels breaking open at once. The wheel rolls on, pressing the grain against the granite bed, flattening it, tearing the softened hulls, and releasing the white, starchy interior that squeezes out and smears across the stone in a creamy paste. The horse walks in a steady circle, and the starch maker walks beside him for the first few rounds, a hand resting lightly on the bridle to guide the pace. The circle is perhaps 20 feet in diameter, a path that takes the horse out of the mill room and into the edge of the stable yard before bringing him back under the roof again, and the route is worn into the ground so deeply that the horse could follow it with his eyes closed. The sky overhead is a pale grey, the clouds hanging low and unbroken, and a seagull passes over once with a slow beat of its wings before veering away toward the sea that lies somewhere beyond the dikes. The sound of the mill is a low rhythmic grinding that vibrates up through the flagstones and into the wooden walls, a sound that is less a noise than a presence, a deep hum that settles into the bones and becomes, after a while, almost indistinguishable from silence. After the first few revolutions, the starch maker releases the bridle and steps back to let the horse walk alone. The gelding does not falter or change his pace. He simply continues in the same slow, steady circle, his head bobbing gently with each step, his ears flicking forward and back in a relaxed automatic motion. The leather straps of the harness creak softly, and the wooden shaft turns and turns, and the runner stone rolls over the grain again and again, crushing it finer with each pass. The starch maker watches for a few moments more, and then he goes to the wooden spout that brings water from the raised tank and adjusts the thin trickle that will be needed to turn the crushed grain into a slurry. The water tank is a large open-topped cistern made of oak planks bound with iron, standing on a brick platform at the side of the mill room, so that gravity carries the water down through a wooden pipe to a spout that overhangs the stone bed. The starch maker fills the tank each morning by working the hand pump that draws water from the canal through a lead pipe that runs under the loading door, and the water has been sitting in the tank for some hours now, settling and warming slightly from the coolness of the canal to the mild temperature of the air. He turns a small wooden valve, and water begins to flow from the spout in a thin, steady trickle, a silver thread that drops onto the mill bed just ahead of the runner wheel. The water lands on the crushed grain with a soft, pattering sound, and as the wheel rolls through it, the water mixes with the starchy paste and turns it into a creamy liquid that slides off the edge of the stone bed and into a shallow trough that leads to the washing room. The color of the liquid is a pale, milky white, the consistency of thin porridge, and it flows in a continuous, slow stream down a channel cut into the granite and out through a hole in the brick wall. The starch maker watches the flow for a moment, adjusting the water valve by the smallest fraction so that the slurry is neither too thick nor too thin, and then he is satisfied and turns away. The horse continues his circle, and the mill turns, and the starch maker occupies himself with the small tasks that fill the hours of grinding. He checks the pails of steeped grain, noting how many remain and how much longer the grinding will take, and he calculates in his head that the morning's work will be done by the time the town bell rings for noon. He takes a brush made of stiff boar bristles and sweeps the edges of the mill bed where bits of crushed grain have spattered, pushing the pale paste back into the path of the wheel. He checks the harness of the horse again, though he did so only half an hour before, and he finds everything still snug and comfortable. The horse walks on, his hooves making a steady, rhythmic clop on the flagstones, and the runner stone rolls and crushes, and the slurry flows. The grinding is not a swift process. It takes the better part of the morning to crush all 6 barrels of grain, and the starch maker does not hurry the horse or try to speed his pace. The gelding walks at the rate that is natural to him, a slow, ambling gait that is barely faster than a man's stroll, and the stone turns at the same unhurried speed. This is the way it has always been done. A faster pace would heat the stone and the grain, and heat would alter the starch in ways that would make it less pure, less white, less able to stiffen the finest ruff. So the horse walks slowly, and the starch maker waits, and the morning passes in the quiet, grinding rhythm of the mill. Every hour, the starch maker stops the horse for a rest. He does this by stepping into the path and lifting a hand, and the gelding halts at once, his forward motion ceasing with a gentle, rocking pause. The great runner stone creaks to a stop on the bed, and the mill falls silent, a silence that seems deeper than it was before the grinding began, broken only by the distant cry of a gull and the soft drip of water from the spout that the starch maker has turned off. During these rests, the starch maker checks the horse's hooves for any stone or compacted grain that might have lodged in the frog, and he brushes the glossy neck that steams faintly in the cool air, the warmth of the animal condensing into a thin, visible vapor. The horse stands patiently, his eyes half closed, and sometimes he lowers his head and nudges the starch maker's shoulder with his soft nose, a quiet gesture that asks for nothing but a scratch behind the ear, which the starch maker gives him. The starch maker also uses these pauses to examine the progress of the grinding. He scoops a small amount of the slurry from the trough with a flat stick and rubs it between his fingers, feeling the texture. The crushed grain should be reduced to a fine, consistent paste with no large fragments of hull remaining, and the starch should be fully released from the gluten so that the two can be separated in the washing. If he feels a graininess, a slight resistance that suggests the grinding is not fine enough, he adjusts the height of the runner stone by a tiny increment, turning a wooden screw mechanism that lowers the axle by the thickness of a fingernail. This adjustment is a delicate task, for too much pressure would crush the grain too finely and break the starch granules themselves, while too little would leave the work incomplete. The starch maker makes the adjustment with the calm precision of long practice, and when the horse begins to walk again, the grinding is just slightly finer than it was before. As the noon hour approaches, the last pail of steeped grain is emptied onto the mill bed, and the runner wheel rolls over it with the same slow, crushing rhythm that has been going on since early morning. The slurry that flows from the trough is now the final batch, and the starch maker watches it move down the channel with a quiet sense of completion. When the stone has passed over the last of the grain and the bed is clean except for a thin, sticky residue, the starch maker calls the horse to a halt for the final time. He unharnesses the gelding, unbuckling the leather straps and lifting the heavy collar away from the warm, damped neck, and he leads the horse back to the stable where a bucket of fresh water and a measure of oats are waiting. The horse drinks deeply, the water sloshing in the bucket, and then he turns to the hayrack and begins to pull at the dried grass with a steady rhythmic chewing that matches the pace of the mill. Back in the mill room, the starch maker begins the cleaning. He takes a wooden scraper and works the residue of crushed grain from the surface of the granite bed, pushing the sticky paste into the trough and then rinsing the stone with a bucket of clean water that he sloshes across the surface and wipes away with a coarse cloth. The runner wheel is cleaned in the same way, the starch maker walking around it and wiping each section of the rim until it is free of any clinging paste that would dry and harden and throw the balance off the next time it was used. The trough is flushed with water from the tank, and the channel is scrubbed with a small brush until the wood gleams white and clean. The tools are hung back on their hooks, the pails are rinsed and stacked, and the floor is swept of the stray bits of grain that have scattered during the grinding. The mill room, now silent and clean, stands ready for the next batch of grain that will come after the barge makes its next delivery. The great stone wheel rests motionless on its bed, and the granite surface dries slowly in the moving air, the damp patches fading from dark grey to the pale pink-speckled hue of the dry stone. The horse's empty traces hang from their peg on the wall, and the turning beam is still, the oak axle settled into its bearing with a final, silent creak. The starch maker stands for a moment in the open doorway, looking out at the stable yard where the horse is now dozing in the loose box, one hind hoof cocked in a pose of perfect rest. The sky is still grey and low, and the air smells of the canal and the faint, lingering sweetness of crushed grain, and the starch maker draws a long, slow breath before turning back into the factory to continue the work that will take the slurry onward to the washing room and the separation of the starch. The washing room lies beyond the mill room, a space that is brighter and cleaner than the other parts of the factory because the work done here requires the starch maker to see the smallest changes in the water and the finest particles that float within it. The walls are whitewashed to a pale cream color that reflects the light from two larger windows set high on the canal side, and the floor is laid with smooth, square tiles of a reddish clay that have been fitted so tightly together that no water can seep between them into the earth below. The room is arranged around a wide, shallow copper basin that stands on 4 stout legs of oak, its rim reaching to the starch maker's waist, and its interior gleaming with the ruddy, polished glow of metal that has been scoured clean every day for decades. Above the basin, a raised wooden tank feeds a pipe that ends in a brass tap, and beside the tank, a hand pump of black iron rises from the floor, its handle worn bright where the palm has gripped it. The slurry from the mill has been collected in a large wooden tub that sits on a low cart near the door, and the starch maker wheels this cart across the tiled floor until it stands beside the copper basin. The slurry is a thick, creamy liquid the color of raw milk, flecked here and there with tiny fragments of bran that were not crushed finely enough by the millstone, and it has settled slightly during the short wait so that a layer of denser, whiter paste lies at the bottom, while a thinner, grayer liquid floats above. The starch maker stirs the tub with a long wooden paddle to mix it back into an even consistency. The motion's slow and circular, and the smell of the slurry rises up, a mild, bready scent with the faint sourness that has come all the way from the steeping room. He opens the brass tap above the basin, and clean water flows down in a steady, clear stream, filling the copper vessel to just below the rim. The water in the tank has been drawn from the canal that morning and left to sit so that the chill has gone out of it, for very cold water would make the gluten tighten and become harder to separate from the starch. The temperature is now cool, but not cold, the same temperature as the air in the room, and the starch maker tests it by dipping 2 fingers into the basin and holding them there for a moment before nodding to himself and turning back to the tub of slurry. He begins to pour the slurry into the basin, tilting the tub with a careful, steady motion, so that the pale liquid slides over the copper rim in a slow, thick ribbon that coils into the clear water like cream poured into tea. He does not pour it all at once, but works in batches, adding roughly a third of the tub to the basin before setting the tub down and reaching for the broad wooden spatula that hangs from a hook on the wall. The spatula is made of beechwood, with a blade as wide as a man's hand and as thin as a shingle, and its edges are rounded and smooth from long use. The starch maker lowers the blade into the basin and begins to stir the mixture with a gentle, circular motion that moves the water and the slurry together without splashing or churning. The stirring is a slow, patient work that requires a steady hand and a quiet attention. The starch maker does not beat the water or agitate it roughly, for that would break the fine particles of starch and make them harder to settle later. Instead, he moves the spatula in a smooth, regular circle, his wrist turning with a rhythm that is almost hypnotic, the same movement repeated over and over until the slurry and the water have become one pale, opaque liquid that fills the basin. As he stirs, the gluten begins to gather itself together in the moving water, the long, sticky proteins finding each other and clinging in soft, elastic masses that form slowly, like clouds condensing from a mist. The starch maker watches these masses take shape, his eyes following the pale, stringy clumps as they drift and coalesce, and he continues to stir until the gluten has collected into a single cohesive mass that rides on the spatula when he lifts it from the water. The mass of gluten is roughly the size of a small loaf of bread, a grayish, sticky lump that stretches and pulls when he handles it, its texture like a very stiff dough that has been over-kneaded. The starch maker works this mass with his fingers, pressing and folding it under the water to release any pockets of starch that have been trapped inside, and the water around his hands grows cloudier with each squeeze as the starch particles separate and float free. He does this for some time, patiently working the gluten until it gives up no more white into the water, and then he lifts the mass out and sets it aside in a wooden bowl that sits on the bench. The gluten will be collected over the course of the day and later taken to the baker down the street, a man who works in a small shop behind the weighhouse and who uses this grey, sticky paste to give his cheaper loaves a bit of chew and substance. Or if the baker has enough already, the gluten will be fed to the hens in the yard behind the stable, who scratch and peck at it with their sharp beaks and seem to find it a great treat. With the first batch of gluten removed, the starch maker turns his attention to the liquid that remains in the basin, a cloudy, milky water that holds the suspended starch in countless fine granules too small to see with the naked eye. This liquid must now be passed through the sieves, a succession of graduated linen cloths stretched across wooden frames that stand in a row on the bench. The first sieve is the coarsest. Its weave open enough to let the starch pass through, but fine enough to catch any bits of bran or hull that the millstone missed. The second is finer, the third finer still, and the fourth is so fine that it feels smooth to the touch like a well-worn handkerchief. Its threads so closely woven that even the tiniest speck of impurity will be caught and held. The starch maker lifts the first sieve frame and sets it across the mouth of a clean wooden tub that stands on the floor. He takes a smaller copper dipper and begins to ladle the milky liquid from the basin through the sieve, pouring it slowly so that it does not overflow the frame. The liquid passes through the linen with a soft, whispering sound. A gentle rush of white that leaves behind on the cloth a thin layer of brownish specks and tiny fragments of bran. When the layer of residue builds up to the point where the flow begins to slow, the starch maker scrapes the cloth gently with a flat wooden spatula and adds the scrapings to the bowl of gluten, and then he continues the dipping and pouring until all the liquid from the first batch has passed through the coarsest cloth. He moves the sieve frame to the next tub and repeats the process with the second sieve, the one with the finer weave. This time the residue left on the cloth is lighter in color and finer in texture, a pale, silty deposit that contains the smallest particles of bran and the last traces of gluten that were not removed by hand. The liquid that passes through is now a smoother, purer white, the starch granules more completely separated from everything else that the wheat had contained. The third sieve leaves almost no visible residue at all, only a faint, translucent film on the linen that the starch maker wipes away with a cloth. And by the time the liquid has passed through the fourth and finest sieve, it is as smooth and uniform as fresh cream, a pure suspension of starch in clean water that carries no trace of the field or the mill or the steep. The sieving is a patient, repetitive labor that fills the morning with a quiet, methodical rhythm. The starch maker dips and pours, scrapes and wipes, moves the frames from tub to tub, and the level of the liquid in the basin slowly drops, while the level in the settling tubs slowly rises. He pauses now and then to stretch his back and to rinse his hands in a bucket of clean water, and he listens to the sounds of the factory around him, the distant cluck of the hens in the yard, the creak of a shutter moving in the breeze, the soft, constant lapping of the canal against the loading door. The light through the windows shifts from the pale grey of morning to a brighter, whiter grey as the sun climbs behind the clouds, and the tiles on the floor show the faint shadows of the sieve frames falling across them in long, slanting lines. When the first batch of liquid has been fully sieved and stands in the settling tubs, the starch maker returns to the copper basin and begins the process again with the second third of the slurry. He pours the thick liquid into fresh water, stirs it slowly with the broad spatula, watches the gluten form and gather, works it with his fingers, and sets it aside in the bowl. He sieves the milky water through the 4 frames in succession, scraping and wiping and moving the liquid along, and the settling tubs fill higher with each batch. The third and final batch follows the same sequence, and by the time it is done the bowl of gluten is full and heavy, a greyish elastic mound that wobbles slightly when the bench is bumped, and the settling tubs contain all the starch that was hidden inside the 12 sacks of winter wheat. The starch maker carries the bowl of gluten to the loading door and sets it outside on the stone threshold where the baker's boy will collect it on his afternoon round. The boy, a lad of about 10 with a thatch of pale hair and a smudged apron, comes by every day with a small handcart and picks up whatever gluten the factory has produced, and he always nods once to the starch maker without speaking before trundling off along the cobbles. The gelding in the yard lifts his head and watches the boy pass, his ears pricked forward, and then he returns to his hay. Back in the washing room, the starch maker begins the cleaning of the equipment that will be needed again in a few days, when the next steeping is ready. The copper basin is scrubbed with a paste of water and fine sand that polishes the metal to a bright, rosy glow, and then it is rinsed with clean water and dried with a linen cloth that leaves no fibers behind. The sieve frames are taken apart, the linen cloths carefully removed and washed in a bucket of clean water, their delicate threads examined for any tear or thin spot that might need mending before the next use. The wooden spatula is wiped clean and hung on its hook. The dipper is rinsed and set upside down to drain, and the tiled floor is mopped with a wide, flat mop made of twisted rags until the reddish clay gleams damp and clean. The settling tubs now stand in a row against the wall of the washing room, Their contents are smooth, opaque white that is still faintly in motion from the pouring tiny currents, swirling slowly beneath the surface like clouds seen from above. The starch maker places a wooden lid loosely on each tub to keep out the dust, and he opens the small vent in the wall that lets the cool air circulate, and then he leaves the room and closes the door gently behind him. The starch is now in the water, suspended and invisible, and it will settle in its own time, pulled down by the patient gravity of the earth. There is nothing more to do for it now but wait, and the starch maker knows how to wait. He has been waiting for starch to settle since he was a young man, learning the trade from his father, and the quiet hours of settling are as much a part of the process as the grinding and the washing, hours in which the factory rests and the canal flows, and the starch falls silently through the dark water toward the bottom of the tubs. The settling room is the quietest space in the factory, a long narrow chamber that sits between the washing room and the staircase to the drying loft, and it is a place where time seems to move at a different pace than it does in the streets outside. The walls here are of bare brick, unpainted and unwhitewashed, and they have darkened over the years to a deep, brownish red that absorbs the light rather than reflecting it, so that even at noon the room holds a gentle, shadowed dimness that is restful to the eyes. The floor is made of the same reddish tiles as the washing room, though these are older and more worn, their surfaces hollowed slightly in the centers where countless footsteps have passed. There are no windows in this room, only two small vents, high in the wall, that open to the canal side and let in a thread of fresh air that moves continually through the space without ever creating a draft strong enough to ripple the surface of the water in the tubs. The settling tubs stand in two long rows that run the length of the room, each one a rectangular vat made of thick pine planks that have been planed smooth on the inside and bound with iron straps at the corners. They are not barrels but open-topped vessels, broader than they are deep, designed to present the greatest possible surface area so that the starch particles have the shortest distance to fall. The wood of the tubs is pale and smooth, almost white in the dim light, and has been scrubbed so often and so thoroughly over the years that it has taken on a soft, silky texture, like driftwood, that has been worn by sand and sea. Each tub rests on a wooden frame that pivots at one end, a simple mechanism of oak pegs and iron brackets that allows the starch maker to tilt the vat slightly when the time comes to pour off the water, and a small wooden wedge is slicked under the raised end to hold it steady. The milky liquid from the washing room has been divided among the tubs, each one filled to within 2 finger widths of the rim so that no settling motion will spill a single drop over the edge. The surface of the liquid is perfectly smooth and perfectly opaque, a uniform white that looks solid enough to touch, like the surface of a fine porcelain glaze before it is fired. The starch maker stands in the doorway and looks at the tubs for a long, quiet moment, noting the stillness of the liquid and the cool, steady temperature of the room, and then he turns away and goes about the other work of the factory while the settling begins. The settling is a process that cannot be hurried and cannot be helped along by any hand. The starch granules, tiny and pale and invisible to the eye, are suspended in the water not by any force but by the simple fact of their lightness, their smallness, their reluctance to sink. But they are heavier than water, and gravity is a patient, relentless force that works without pause, and so the granules begin to fall. They fall so slowly that no human eye could watch them do it. A descent that is measured in fractions of a hair's breadth per minute. A sinking so gradual that it would take an hour of watching to see any change at all in the water above them. But they fall, and as they fall, the water above them grows clearer. By the time the town bell rings for noon, the change is barely visible, but it has begun. The surface of the liquid in the tubs is no longer a solid white, but has taken on the faintest translucency, a darkening at the very top where the first few millimeters of water have cleared. The starch maker comes into the settling room and looks at the tubs without touching them, his eyes moving from one to the next, noting the degree of clearing in each. The liquid is now a gradient of white, pale and thin at the top, thick and dense at the bottom, where the starch has begun to gather in a soft, loose sediment. He nods to himself and leaves the room, and the settling continues through the quiet hours of the afternoon. The factory is still during these hours, its work suspended while the starch does its own work of sinking. The starch maker takes his midday meal sitting on a wooden stool by the loading door, a piece of dark bread and a slice of hard cheese and a small withered apple from the tree in the yard behind the stable that produces fruit of no particular quality, but with a reliable, sour persistence. He eats slowly, his eyes on the canal where a barge passes now and then, and he listens to the sounds of the town drifting over the water, the distant ring of the smith's hammer, the cry of a child playing in the street, the low murmur of voices from the brewery where the workers are resting in the shade. The horse stands in the yard with his head over the gate, his eyes half closed, and a sparrow hops along the cobbles, pecking at invisible specks. The starch maker finishes his meal and brushes the crumbs from his lap into the canal for the ducks that paddle near the loading door, and then he returns inside. By late afternoon, the settling has progressed enough that the starch maker can begin the first draining. He enters the settling room and goes to the first tub in the row, the one that was filled earliest in the morning, and he looks closely at the water. The top third of the liquid is now nearly clear, a pale watery grey that shows the shadow of the wood grain through it, while the lower two-thirds remain densely white. The starch packed loosely at the bottom, in a layer that is soft and mobile like a thick custard that has not yet set. The boundary between the clear water and the settled starch is a distinct but wavering line that shifts slightly if the tub is bumped, a soft, cloudy horizon that divides the two states of the liquid. The starch maker takes hold of the tub frame and lifts the wooden wedge from under the pivoted end, letting the tub settle back to level. Then he inserts the wedge under the opposite end, tilting the tub very gently so that the water rises at one corner and the settled starch sinks further into the opposite side, held there by gravity and the slight angle of the floor. He takes a small brass tap from a hook on the wall and fits it into a hole near the top rim of the tub, a hole that is plugged with a soft wooden stopper when not in use. The tap is a simple device, a short tube with a valve that can be opened and closed by a small lever, and it allows the water to flow out without disturbing the settled starch below. The starch maker places a wooden bucket under the tap and opens the valve with a slow, careful motion. The water begins to flow, a thin, steady stream of pale grey liquid that splashes softly into the bucket with a sound like rain falling on a distant roof. He watches the level of the water in the tub drop, and he watches the boundary line between the clear liquid and the settled starch, making sure that the two do not mix. The water that pours out is not entirely clear, for it still holds some starch that has not yet fallen, a faint milky haze that will be captured and returned to the next settling. But it is clear enough that the starch maker can see the bottom of the bucket through it when the bucket is nearly full. He closes the valve, carries the bucket to a spare tub that stands against the wall, and pours the drained water into it. The water will be left to settle again overnight, and the fine starch that drifts out of it will be collected and added to the next batch. He returns to the first tub and tilts it a little further, the wedge driven deeper under the frame, and he opens the tap again. More water flows out, and the settled starch at the bottom of the tub grows thicker and denser as the water above it is removed, its surface rising slowly toward the draining tap. When the boundary line is no more than a hand's width below the tap, the starch maker closes the valve and stops the flow. He removes the tap and plugs the hole with a wooden stopper, and he tilts the tub back to level, removing the wedge and setting the frame flat on the floor. Now comes the addition of fresh water. The starch maker goes to the washing room and draws clean water from the raised tank, carrying it back in two wooden pails that he holds at his sides, his arms straight and his steps steady. He pours the water into the tub slowly, letting it slide down the inner wall so that it does not plunge into the settled starch and stir it up. The water fills the tub again, rising over the white layer below, and as it does so, it begins the second stage of the settling. The starch at the bottom still contains impurities that were carried down with it, tiny particles of gluten and fine bran, and the dust of the millstone, and the fresh water will wash these impurities upward by diffusion, carrying them out of the starch and into the clear liquid above. The second settling is as important as the first, for it is this washing that gives the starch its final whiteness, its pure, bright color that will never yellow and never stain. The starch maker moves from tub to tub, repeating the process of draining and refilling with the same slow, careful motions. The first tub is drained and refilled, the second tub is drained and refilled, and so on down the row until every tub in the settling room has been attended to. The work is repetitive and quiet. a series of small actions that follow one another in an unbroken chain, and the starch maker moves through it with the calm, unhurried rhythm of a man who expects nothing else from his day. The light in the settling room grows dimmer as the afternoon wears on, the soft, shadowed darkness deepening, and when the last tub has been refilled, the starch maker lights the small tin lantern that hangs from a beam and carries it with him as he checks each tub one final time. The water in the tubs is now a pale milky white again. They're much thinner and more translucent than it was after the washing, and the settled starch lies at the bottom in a dense chalky layer that is beginning to take on the firmer consistency of a thick paste. The starch maker looks at the tubs and sees that the second settling is already underway, the fine particles falling again through the clean water, the last impurities rising upward in a slow, invisible exchange. He leaves the settling room and closes the door gently, and he goes to the loading door to watch the evening gather over the canal. The second draining comes the next morning, when the water in the tubs is as clear as the canal on a windless day, a transparent, faintly amber-tinted liquid that shows the settled starch at the bottom as a white, solid-looking mass. The starch maker drains this water off with the same tilting and tapping as before, and this time the water is so clear that he can pour it directly into the canal grate, for it holds nothing more of value. He adds fresh water and lets the settling begin a third time, a third washing that will ensure the starch is as pure as it can possibly be. By the evening of the second day, the third settling is complete, and the water above the starch is as clear as the rainwater that collects in the cistern on the roof. The starch maker comes into the settling room with a flat wooden scoop and a shallow pail, and he stands before the first tub with the calm satisfaction of a workman who knows that his work has been done well. The water has been drained away for the last time, and what remains in the tub is a thick, heavy paste, the consistency of cold cream, a dense white layer that holds the shape of the scoop when it is dug into it. The starch that was hidden inside the winter wheat, that was released by the steeping and the crushing and the stirring and the sieving, has now been gathered and purified and made ready for the final stage of the process. The starch maker scoops the paste into the pail with a slow, steady motion, the flat blade sliding under the white mass and lifting it out in neat, smooth blocks that leave a faint, ridged pattern on the wood of the tub. Each tub yields about half a pail of the paste, and by the time he has worked his way down the row, the pails are full and heavy, their contents glistening faintly in the lantern light like fresh snow that has begun to melt. The pails are carried to the drying loft, and the settling room stands empty for a while, its tubs clean and dry and waiting, the faint scent of wet starch hanging in the air like the memory of the work. The starch maker closes the door of the settling room and goes up the narrow stairs with the first of the pails, and the settling is done. The staircase to the drying loft is narrow and steep, little more than a ladder with broad treads, and it rises from the back corner of the settling room through a square opening in the ceiling that is fitted with a wooden hatch. The starch maker climbs these stairs with a pail of wet starch paste in each hand, his shoulders brushing the walls on both sides, his footsteps falling in a slow, steady rhythm that makes the old timbers creak in a familiar pattern. The wood of the stairs is worn smooth in the center of each tread, hollowed by the passage of feet over so many years that the grain of the pine shows in soft, undulating lines that catch the light from the lantern swinging at his belt. The air grows cooler as he climbs, the damp warmth of the settling room giving way to a fresher, drier atmosphere that carries the faint scent of the open sky and the distant salt tang of the sea. The drying loft occupies the entire upper floor of the factory, a long open space that runs from the front gable overlooking the canal to the rear gable that faces the stable yard. The roof slopes sharply on both sides, the dark tiles visible on the underside where the rafters and the laths are exposed, and the peak rises high enough that a tall man can stand upright in the center of the loft without bending his head. The floor is made of wide pine boards that have been laid with narrow gaps between them so that the air can circulate from below, and they are scrubbed as clean as every other surface in the factory, pale and smooth and bare. The walls are whitewashed to the height of a man's shoulder, and above that the brick is left bare, a warm, reddish brown that darkens in the evening shadows. At regular intervals along both slopes of the roof, louvered shutters are set into the tiles, their slats angled downward and outward so that the rain cannot enter but the air can move freely. These shutters are opened and closed by a system of wooden rods and levers that run along the rafters, a clever arrangement of pegs and notches that allows the starch maker to control the flow of air through the loft without climbing up to each individual shutter. In the summer months, the shutters stand wide open and the loft is filled with a steady, gentle current of fresh air that moves from the canal side to the stable side, carrying with it the scent of water and hay and the faint, clean smell of the wool that is stored in the merchant's warehouse next door. In the winter, the shutters are kept mostly closed, opened only for an hour at midday, when the air is at its driest, and the loft holds a still, cold silence that is broken only by the occasional creak of a rafter settling into its joint. The drying racks fill the loft in long, orderly rows that run from one end of the space to the other, like the shelves of a sleeping library. Each rack is a wooden frame of light pine, as tall as a man and as wide as his outstretched arms, fitted with horizontal slats that can hold the drying trays at different heights. The trays themselves are shallow rectangles of thin beechwood, their bottoms covered with a layer of clean linen that has been washed and bleached until it is as white as the starch it will hold. The linen is stretched taut and fastened to the tray edges with small wooden pegs that fit into holes drilled at regular intervals, and it is renewed every few months when it begins to show the wear of repeated use, the fibers thinning and pulling away from the pegs. The starch maker sets his pails down on the floor at the end of the nearest rack and pauses for a moment to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand. The climb up the stairs with the heavy pails has warmed him slightly, and he opens the collar of his shirt by one button to let the moving air reach his skin. The loft is quiet. The only sound, the soft sigh of the breeze through the louvers and the distant, muted cry of a seagull somewhere over the rooftops. The light is soft and diffuse, filtered through the slats of the shutters so that it falls in pale, slanting bars that move slowly across the floor as the clouds pass over the sun. He begins the work of spreading the starch paste onto the trays. He takes the first tray from the rack and sets it on a low wooden bench that stands near the head of the stairs, a bench that has been used for this same purpose for so long that its top is stained a permanent chalky white that no amount of scrubbing can remove. The tray is light in his hands, the linen smooth and tight, and he sets it down with the care that one might use when handling a sheet of fine paper. From the pail he takes the flat wooden scoop, the same tool that he used to lift the paste from the settling tubs, and he digs it into the thick, white mass and lifts out a portion about the size of a small loaf. The paste spreads onto the linen with a soft, slow motion, the starch maker working the scoop in a gentle arc that pushes the white mass outward from the center toward the edges. He does not press hard or hurry, for the paste must be spread in an even layer, no thicker than the width of a finger, uniformly smooth and free of any lumps or ridges that would dry unevenly and leave hard spots in the finished starch. The paste responds to the pressure of the scoop with a slow, reluctant flow, its surface holding the faint marks of the wood grain for a moment before settling back into a smooth, creamy plane. The starch maker works his way around the tray, adding small dabs of paste where the layer is too thin and smoothing away any excess where it is too thick, and when he is finished, the tray holds a perfect, level rectangle of white that gleams softly in the diffused light. The filled tray is lifted and slid onto the lowest slat of the drying rack, and the starch maker takes the next tray from the stack and begins again. The work is repetitive and quiet, a sequence of motions that repeats without variation, the scoop dipped into the pail, the paste spread onto the linen, the tray lifted and placed on the rack. The starch maker moves through this sequence with the calm, unhurried rhythm that marks every task in the factory, his hands working while his mind drifts in a quiet, wordless state of attention that is not quite thought and not quite daydream. The light bars creep across the floor, and the breeze shifts through the louvers, and the trays fill one by one and take their places on the racks. When a pail is empty, the starch maker carries it back down the stairs and returns with another full one, and the work continues. The wet starch paste begins to fill the lower slats of the first rack, and then the second, and the loft slowly takes on the appearance of a room that is filling with white, the pale rectangles of the trays glowing softly in the dim, filtered light. The smell of the wet starch is clean and mild, a faint cereal scent that is not the sourness of the steeping room or the breadiness of the washing room, but something purer, lighter, the smell of the starch itself, unmixed with any other substance. It takes the better part of the morning to spread all the starch from the settling room onto the trays, and by the time the last tray has been filled and the last pail has been carried back down the stairs, the drying loft holds a quiet, orderly arrangement of white that stretches from one end to the other. The starch maker walks slowly along the rows of racks, his eyes passing over each tray in turn, checking the evenness of the spreading and the depth of the paste. Here and there he finds a tray where the layer is slightly too thick at one corner, and he smooths it with a gentle pass of the scoop. Elsewhere he finds a tray where a small air bubble has been trapped under the surface, and he pricks it with the point of a wooden skewer that he keeps in a pocket of his apron. The bubble releases with a tiny wet sigh, and the paste settles into the space it left behind. For several days the starch will remain in the loft, drying by the slow breath of the climate that moves through the louvered shutters. There is no fire lit anywhere in the factory for the purpose of drying, no stove or brazier or heated stone that would rush the process. The heat of a fire would drive the moisture out too quickly and cause the starch cakes to crack and warp, and it might also darken the starch, giving it a yellowish tinge that no laundress in the town would accept for a burgher's ruff. So the drying is left to the air and to the patient passage of the hours, a slow evaporation that takes its own time and cannot be hurried. The starch maker visits the drying loft at noon each day, climbing the narrow stairs to check on the progress of the starch. On the first day, the surface of the paste has begun to form a thin, dry skin, a delicate film that wrinkles slightly when he touches it with the tip of a finger. The paste beneath the skin is still soft and moist, and the linen under the trays is damp to the touch where the water has begun to seep downward through the porous wood. On the second day, the skin has thickened, and the paste has shrunk slightly away from the edges of the tray, pulling inward as the moisture leaves it, and leaving a narrow, clean border of bare linen all the way around. The color is whiter now, no longer the creamy hue of the fresh paste, but a purer, brighter white that reflects the light in a clean, even glow. On the third day, the starch maker comes to the loft and finds that the paste has dried enough to be flipped. He takes each tray from its slat and carries it to the bench, and he loosens the edges of the starch cake with a thin, flat stick of beechwood that he works gently under the surface, separating the cake from the linen. The cake comes away in a single piece, a soft white block that holds its shape, but crumbles slightly at the corners when it is handled. He flips the cake over onto a fresh tray lined with clean linen, so that the side that was against the linen is now exposed to the air and can dry as well. He brushes a bit of dust from the linen of the first tray, a few dry specks of starch that have fallen from the edges of the cakes, and he stacks the tray to be washed and reused. The starch maker also tends to the shutters during these visits, adjusting the angle of the louvers according to the weather outside. If the day is damp and the air is heavy with the threat of rain, he closes the shutters on the canal side and opens only those on the stable side, where the air is drier and the wind blows from the east. If the day is dry and the sun is bright behind the clouds, he opens all the shutters wide and lets the loft fill with a steady, gentle breeze that stirs the air and carries the moisture away. He checks that no bird has found a way through the gaps in the louvers, though none ever has, for the shutters are well made and close tightly when needed. By the end of the fourth day, the starch cakes are dry through and through. They have shrunk to about 2/3 of their original size, and they are hard and brittle, a pure chalky white that leaves a fine dust on the fingers when they are touched. The starch maker tests a cake by breaking off a small corner and rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling it crumble into a fine silky powder that is lighter than flour and clings faintly to the skin. The texture is perfect, dry and smooth, and free of any grittiness that would indicate an impurity in the starch. He nods to himself and begins to gather the dry cakes from the trays, stacking them in a clean, dry pail that he has brought up from the washing room. The trays are taken down from the racks and stacked near the head of the stairs, their linen covers to be washed and bleached and pegged back onto the frames for the next batch of starch. The drying loft, now empty of its white burden, stands quiet and still, the racks bare and the shutters open to the soft, grey light of the afternoon. The starch maker carries the pail of dry cakes down the narrow stairs, his feet finding the worn hollows in the treads without a thought, and he brings the starch to the bench in the main workshop, where the final stage of the process will take place. The starch has been steeped and crushed and washed and settled and dried, and now it needs only to be powdered and bagged and carried out into the town to serve the purpose for which it was made. The main workshop lies at the front of the factory, a room that stretches across the width of the building just behind the loading door. And it is here that the starch maker spends the final hours of each batch, turning the dry white cakes into the fine, silky powder that will be tied into linen bags and carried out to the houses of the town. The room is brighter than the steeping room and warmer than the settling room, for it has 2 windows that face the canal and catch the afternoon light as it slants across the water. The walls are lined with wooden shelves that hold the tools and supplies of the trade, spare lengths of linen, hanks of undyed wool twine, a row of brass weights in diminishing sizes, a small iron stove that is lit only in the deepest cold of winter, and a collection of earthenware jars sealed with cork stoppers. The floor is made of the same worn flagstones as the loading area, and in the center of the room stands the workbench, a massive slab of oak that has been scrubbed so often and so thoroughly that its surface is as smooth and pale as the flesh of a mushroom. On the workbench rests the rolling pin, a cylinder of white marble as long as a man's forearm and as thick as his wrist, polished to a glossy smoothness that catches the light in a soft, creamy shimmer. The marble comes from a quarry far to the south, in a region of mountains that the starch maker has never seen, and it was bought by his father from a stone merchant in Amsterdam, who imported it from Italy. The weight of the marble is enough to crush the starch cakes without any pressing or leaning from the hand, and its cool, dense surface does not absorb moisture or impart any taste or color to the powder, a quality that no wooden rolling pin could match. Beside the rolling pin, a flat granite slab is set into the surface of the workbench, a smaller cousin of the great millstone bed that stands in the mill room, and its surface is smooth and true, honed flat by a stonemason long ago. The starch maker brings the pail of dry cakes to the workbench and sets it on the floor at his feet. He takes a cake from the pail and holds it up to the light that falls through the canal window, turning it in his fingers and looking at it closely. The cake is a pale, chalky white, its surface rough and slightly powdery, its edges crumbled where it was handled during the flip. It is light in his hand, much lighter than it was when it was a wet paste spread on the linen, and it smells of nothing at all, or rather of a cleanness so pure that it seems like the absence of any smell rather than a scent of its own. The starch maker breaks the cake into 2 pieces with a sharp, clean snap that sends a small puff of white dust into the air, and he looks at the interior that is the same uniform, pure white all the way through, with no yellow core and no grey specks that would indicate a flaw in the processing. He places the broken pieces on the granite slab and takes up the marble rolling pin in both hands, his grip firm but not tight, his fingers wrapped around the ends where the marble is slightly narrower and shaped to fit the hand. He lowers the rolling pin onto the pieces of starch cake and begins to roll it back and forth with a slow, steady pressure that crushes the brittle fragments into smaller and smaller bits. The sound of the crushing is a soft, gritty crunch, a noise like footsteps on fine gravel, and it fills the quiet workshop with a gentle, rhythmic cadence that matches the motion of the rolling pin. The starch maker works the marble cylinder over the slab in a pattern that covers every portion of the surface, a slow, sweeping arc that begins at one edge and moves across to the other, then back again, the pressure even and the motion smooth. As the fragments are crushed, they are reduced to a coarse powder that spreads across the granite in a thin white layer, and the starch maker gathers this powder into a pile at the center of the slab, with a gentle scrape of his palm before continuing to roll. The coarse powder becomes a finer powder as the rolling pin passes over it again and again, the grains breaking down under the weight of the marble until they are as fine as the dust that settles on the rafters of the drying loft. The starch maker pauses now and then to rub a pinch of the powder between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its texture against his skin. At first the powder feels slightly gritty, a faint resistance that tells him the crushing is not yet finished. But as he continues to roll, the texture grows smoother and silkier until the powder feels like nothing at all, a soft, lubricated glide between his fingers that is the sign of a perfect fineness. The starch maker rolls each cake separately, crushing it and reducing it and gathering the powder into a pile at the corner of the slab, and he works his way through the pail of cakes one by one until the pail is empty and the granite slab holds a mound of fine white powder that is as light as snow and as smooth as talc. The pile is large enough to fill both of his cupped hands. and it glows softly in the afternoon light, a pure bright white that seems to have captured and held the light of the sun that fell on the wheat fields the summer before. The starch maker looks at the pile with the same quiet satisfaction that he felt when he looked at the clear water above the settled starch in the tubs, a calm awareness of a thing done properly and well. From the shelves on the wall, he takes down a stack of the small linen bags that had been sewn by his sister in the quiet room at the back of the house where she lives, a few streets away near the church. The bags are made of the same undyed linen as the cloths that line the drying trays, cut into rectangles and folded and stitched along the sides with a fine, even seam, and they are left open at the top with a hem that holds a short length of the woolen twine that will be used to tie them. The bags are not large, each one designed to hold exactly 2 Amsterdam pounds of starch, a measure that has been standard in the trade for as long as anyone can remember, and they are soft and pliable in the hand, the linen smooth and free of any roughness that might catch on the fine lace of a burgher's ruff when the bag is opened. The starch maker's sister is a woman of middle years who rarely speaks, and whose hands are always moving, always busy with the needle and the thread that have been her companions since she was a girl. She sits in a chair by the window of her small room, the light falling across her lap where the linen lies, and she sews the bags with a rhythm that matches the slow tick of the clock in the town tower, the needle going in and out, pulling the thread behind it in a steady, unbroken line. She does not work in the factory itself, for the work of sewing is best done in a quiet, still room where the linen does not pick up the dust of the mill or the damp of the settling tubs, and the starch maker visits her once a week to bring her a fresh bolt of linen and to collect the finished bags that she has sewn since his last visit. The bags are always perfectly made, each seam straight and strong, each drawstring securely anchored, and the starch maker never finds a flaw in them. He takes one of the bags from the stack and opens it, shaking it gently so that the interior is free of any loose threads, and he sets it on the workbench near the pile of powdered starch. From a niche in the wall he takes the brass balance, a simple scale with 2 shallow pans that hang from a central beam by thin chains, and he sets it on the bench and tests its balance by placing a single brass weight in one pan. The pans settle into perfect equilibrium, the beam level and steady, and he removes the weight and sets it aside. The weights themselves are kept in a small wooden box lined with felt, each one a disc of polished brass stamped with the mark of the Amsterdam Assay Office, and they range from 2 pounds down to a single ounce, a full set that allows the starch maker to weigh any quantity with precision. The weighing of the starch is a careful, methodical task that requires a steady hand and a quiet attention to the smallest details. The starch maker places the brass 2-pound weight in the left pan, and he begins to scoop the powdered starch into the right pan with a small copper spoon that he keeps for this purpose alone. The starch falls into the pan in soft, dusty increments, and the beam of the balance begins to tilt slowly as the weight accumulates. The starch maker watches the beam with his calm, steady gaze, adding smaller and smaller pinches of starch as the pans approach equilibrium, until at last the beam levels and the 2 pans hang in perfect, motionless balance, the 2 pounds of starch exactly matching the 2-pound weight from the Amsterdam Assay Office. He lifts the pan and tips the starch into the opened linen bag, pouring it carefully so that none of the fine powder spills or puffs into the air, and he ties the neck of the bag with the woolen twine, drawing it tight and knotting it with a simple, secure knot that will not come loose in transit. The bag is now a neat, soft package that fits comfortably in the palm of the hand, its contents settling with a gentle, dense weight, its linen exterior smooth and clean. The starch maker sets the filled bag aside on a clean square of blue cloth that he has laid out on the end of the bench, and he begins the weighing of the next bag. The work of weighing and bagging fills the late afternoon with a quiet, repetitive rhythm. The scoop of the spoon into the pile of powder, the gentle tapping to shake off the excess, the watching of the balance beam, the pouring into the bag, the tying of the knot. The starch maker moves through this sequence with the same unhurried calm that he brings to every other task in the factory, his hands working with a practiced ease that makes the difficult look simple. The pile of powdered starch on the granite slab grows smaller as the row of filled bags on the blue cloth grows longer, and the light through the canal window shifts from the pale grey of afternoon to the deeper amber-tinted grey of early evening. When the last of the starch has been weighed and bagged, the starch maker counts the filled bags, touching each one with a finger as he numbers them in his head. The count matches his expectation, for the yield of starch from wheat is a known quantity that varies only slightly with the quality of the grain, and he has done this work so many times that he could predict the number of bags before the steeping even began. He takes a small slip of parchment from a drawer in the workbench, a rectangle of scraped sheepskin that is thin and smooth and slightly translucent, and he dips the nib of a quill pen into a small pot of iron gall ink that has been made from oak galls and copperas, and the water of the canal. The ink flows in a dark, fine line as he writes a single initial on the parchment, the letter of his family name, a mark that the burghers of the town have come to trust over the years for a starch that never yellows and never fails to stiffen the finest ruff. He sets the slip of parchment on top of the filled bags, and it curls slightly at the edges, the ink drying to a deep, permanent black. The starch maker cleans the granite slab with a damp cloth, wiping away the last traces of the powdered starch that cling to the stone in a thin white film, and he washes the marble rolling pin and dries it with a soft, clean rag before setting it back in its place on the workbench. The copper spoon is rinsed and dried. The balance is returned to its niche in the wall, and the blue cloth is folded over the top of the filled bags to keep the dust from settling on the clean linen. The workshop is quiet and orderly, the tools put away, the surface is wiped clean, the light fading gently from the windows as the evening gathers over the canal. The starch maker stands for a moment at the workbench, his hands resting on the smooth, pale wood, and he looks at the covered basket of starch bags that will be delivered in the morning. The starch that was wheat, growing in a flat field under the wide grey sky of the Low Countries, harvested and threshed and brought to his door in rough burlap sacks, is now a fine, pure powder wrapped in clean linen and ready to be used. It will be mixed with water and worked into the collars and cuffs and ruffs of the merchants and the magistrates and the ministers of the town, and it will hold them stiff and white through the long hours of the day, a quiet, invisible support that no one will think about or notice or know the origin of. The starch maker thinks about this for a moment, and then he reaches for his own clean collar that hangs on a peg by the door, for tomorrow he will put on his sober dark doublet and carry the basket out into the cobbled streets to make his deliveries, and his appearance must be as neat and as orderly as the starch he sells. The morning of the delivery dawns with a soft grey light that fills the streets of the town like water rising slowly in a basin, and the starch maker rises from his bed in the room under the eaves with the same quiet, unhurried movements that have begun every day of his working life. He washes his face and hands in the basin of cold water, the chill of it drawing the skin tight across his knuckles, and he puts on a clean linen shirt whose collar has been starched and pressed by his own hands the evening before, so that it stands crisp and white against the dark wool of his doublet. The doublet is the same sober brown one he wears every day, but it has been brushed with a stiff brush to remove any trace of the starch dust that settles on everything in the factory, and the buttons of polished bone are fastened with a slow, careful attention that ensures each one sits perfectly in its loop. His breeches are clean, his stockings are pulled smooth, and his soft leather shoes have been wiped free of the white residue that clings to the soles of everything in the workshop. When he is dressed, he looks once around the room that holds nothing but the bed, the chair, the washstand, and the small wooden chest, and then he descends the narrow stairs to the workshop. The basket of starch bags sits on the workbench where he left it the night before, covered by the square of blue cloth that keeps the dust from the clean linen. He folds back the cloth and checks the bags one final time, lifting each one and feeling its weight, making sure that the necks are tied securely and the slip of parchment with his initial is still in place. The bags are neat and uniform, their contents settled into a dense, heavy shape that fills the palm of the hand, and the linen is smooth and clean, free of any stain or mark that might offend the eye of a careful housewife. He replaces the cloth and lifts the basket by its two handles, a sturdy wicker construction that his sister also made, weaving the willow withies in the winter months when the sewing of the bags was done. The basket is not heavy, for the starch is light and the bags are small, and he carries it easily in the crook of one arm as he opens the loading door and steps out onto the stone threshold. The canal is quiet at this hour, the water a dark still mirror that reflects the grey sky and the brick facades with a perfect, glassy fidelity. A few ducks paddle near the bridge, their wakes spreading in smooth, silent fans that disturb nothing, and a woman on the opposite quay is opening her shutters one by one, the wooden panels creaking softly as they swing outward. The air is cool and damp, and carries the clean smell of the water and the faint, distant scent of the sea that lies somewhere beyond the dikes to the west. The starch maker pulls the loading door closed behind him and sets off along the cobbles, his shoes making a soft, steady sound on the worn stones, the basket swinging gently at his side. He walks first to the house of the burgomaster, a tall, narrow building with a stepped gable and a polished brass door-knocker in the shape of a lion's head. The house stands on the Herringgracht, the quietest and most dignified of the town's canals, where the merchants and the magistrates live in houses that are built of the same brownish brick as the factory, but are larger and finer, with wide windows of clear glass and doors painted in dark, sober colours. The starch maker stops at the door and lifts the knocker, letting it fall once with a single, solid rap that echoes down the hall inside. He waits, and after a moment the door is opened by a maidservant in a clean white cap and apron, a young woman with a calm face and hands that are reddened by the work of the kitchen. She recognizes the starch maker at once, for he has been coming to this door for many years, and she nods and steps aside to let him enter. He follows her down the hall to the back room, where the linen is kept, a small, tidy chamber on the ground floor that opens onto the garden and has a door to the wash kitchen, where a copper kettle stands on a brick hearth. The air here is warm and smells of soap and the faint, clean scent of dried lavender that is kept in small muslin bags among the linens. The housekeeper, an older woman with a bunch of keys at her waist and a starched ruff of her own that stands stiff and perfect around her neck, comes forward to receive the starch. She takes the bags one by one, counting them with a quick, practiced eye, and she hands the starch maker a small stack of silver coins that he slips into a leather purse at his belt. The amount is always the same, a fixed price per bag that was established long ago and has never changed, and the transaction is made without any discussion or negotiation. The housekeeper nods to him, and he nods to her, and the door closes softly behind him as he returns to the street. The next delivery is to the house of a merchant who trades in cloth from the East Indies, a man whose ruff is said to be the widest and whitest in the town, and who requires a constant supply of the finest starch to keep it so. The merchant's house is on the next canal, a wider, deeper waterway that is busy with barges carrying goods to the warehouses, and the starch maker crosses a stone bridge and passes the weighhouse and the exchange before he comes to the door. Here it is the merchant's wife who receives him, a woman dressed in black with a ruff of elaborate lace that falls in multiple, rigid folds under her chin, and she examines each bag of starch with a close, critical eye, feeling the weight of it in her hand and peering at the initial on the slip of parchment. She has been buying the starch maker's product for 10 years and has never found a fault with it. But still she looks, for the maintenance of her husband's appearance is a matter of great importance in a house where so much depends on the impression made in the meeting rooms of the exchange. She also pays in silver, counting the coins out carefully from a small purse that hangs at her waist, and the starch maker waits with the basket on his arm until the transaction is complete. He visits the houses of the town's well-to-do one by one, following a route that he has walked every week for as long as he can remember, a path that takes him from the Herringgracht to the Keizersgracht, and then to the Prinsengracht, and then back along the smaller streets behind the church where the lesser merchants and the prosperous shopkeepers live. At each house the door is answered by a servant or a wife or a laundress. The bags are handed over, the coins are paid, and the starch maker moves on to the next. The work is quiet and methodical, a series of small, polite transactions that follow one another in a steady, unbroken chain. And as he walks the streets, the starch maker sees the town going about its morning business. The bakers pulling loaves from their ovens, the fishmongers setting out their wares on beds of ice, brought down from the mountains, the children running to school with their slates under their arms. He nods to the people he knows, and they nod back, and the basket on his arm grows lighter as the bags are delivered. At the house of a widowed lady who lives alone in a small but elegant house behind the church, the starch maker is invited into the back washroom to see how the starch is used. For the lady is proud of her laundry and likes to show the results of her work to anyone who takes an interest. He follows her through the house to a small room that is full of steam from the copper kettle that stands on a hearth of blue and white tiles, and there he watches as the laundress, a woman of middle years with strong arms and a quiet manner, prepares the starch solution for the lady's ruff. The ruff lies on a clean white cloth spread across a wooden table near the window where the light falls bright and clear. It is a wide, circular collar of the finest Flemish lace, its pattern an intricate mesh of loops and curls and tiny open meshes that have been worked by hand in a convent in Antwerp and cost more than the starch maker earns in a year. The ruff has been washed and dried and is now limp and soft, its folds collapsed into a pale, formless ring that gives no hint of the rigid grandeur it will soon possess. The laundress takes one of the starch maker's linen bags and unties the neck, and she tips a measure of the fine white powder into a small copper bowl that she then fills with clean water from a jug, stirring the mixture with a wooden spoon until the starch dissolves into a thin, milky liquid that has the consistency of light cream. She takes the ruff in both hands and lowers it into the bowl, working the fabric gently through the liquid, with slow, patient fingers that press the starch solution into every tiny loop and curl of the lace. The white liquid soaks into the fibers, filling them and coating them, and the ruff becomes heavier and slicker, its pale color deepening to the wet, translucent white of fresh milk. When it is thoroughly saturated, the laundress lifts it from the bowl and squeezes it with a gentle, even pressure that removes the excess liquid without wringing or twisting the delicate threads, and she lays it on a fresh, dry cloth and begins to shape it with her fingers. She coaxes the limp folds into the deep figure of 8 pleats that will give the ruff its distinctive form, pinching the lace between her fingers and smoothing it into crisp, even folds that radiate outward from the center, like the petals of a white flower. The starch maker watches from the doorway, his basket now empty at his side, and he sees the ruff begin to take on the stiff, sculptural shape that will stand around the lady's neck like a white halo when it is dry and pressed. The ruff is set aside on a wooden frame that has been made for this purpose, a circular stand that holds the collar in its proper shape while it dries, and the laundress turns to a fresh one that has just reached the right state of dampness for the ironing. She takes a heavy iron from the hearth, a solid slab of iron with a smooth, polished bottom and a wooden handle that has been worn dark by the grip of many hands, and she tests its heat by touching a damp finger to its surface, where it sizzles gently. The iron is not so hot that it would scorch the fine linen of the ruff, but hot enough to dry the starch and set it into a permanent stiffness that will hold for hours. The laundress wraps the face of the iron in a clean, thin cloth so that the metal does not touch the lace directly and risk marking it, and she begins to press the ruff with a slow, careful motion that works the heat into each fold and pleat of the fabric. The iron moves over the ruff with a soft, steady hiss, the steam rising in small, pale puffs that carry the clean smell of the starch and the faint, warm scent of the heated linen. The laundress works her way around the entire circle of the ruff, pressing and smoothing and pressing again, and as she works, the lace becomes stiff and white and perfectly formed, its folds standing upright in a rigid, symmetrical pattern that will not droop or wilt no matter how long the lady wears it. The ruff, when it is finished, is lifted from the frame and held up to the light that falls through the window, and it gleams with a pure, snowy whiteness that seems almost to glow from within, a perfect, immaculate collar that will frame the lady's face with an aura of quiet, dignified elegance. The starch maker nods once, a slow, satisfied motion of his head, and he turns to leave the house. The lady thanks him at the door, her voice soft and polite, and she presses a small extra coin into his hand, a token of her appreciation for the quality of the starch. He takes it with a quiet word of thanks and slips it into his purse with the others, and then he steps back out into the street, where the morning has now fully settled into the grey, steady light of midday. The empty basket on his arm is light, and he walks back through the town along the same route, passing the church where the clock is striking the noon hour, passing the brewery where the workers are sitting on barrels in the yard, eating their midday meal, passing the cooper's yard where the stacks of barrels have shifted slightly in the breeze. The canal is busier now, the barges moving in a slow, steady stream, their decks loaded with goods from the warehouses that line the waterfront, and the water gate is open wide to let them pass. The starch maker crosses the bridge and comes to his own loading door, and he pushes it open and steps inside the quiet, cool darkness of the factory. He sets the empty basket on the workbench and unties his purse, pouring the coins into his hand and counting them slowly with a finger that moves from one coin to the next. The amount is correct, the same as always, and he opens the small strong box that sits on a shelf behind a loose brick in the wall and adds the coins to the pile that already rests there, a modest accumulation of silver that represents the work of many weeks and many batches of starch. The strong box is locked with a small iron key that he keeps on a cord around his neck, and he tucks it back into the hollow in the wall and replaces the loose brick so that no one would know it was there. The morning deliveries have been made, the coins have been counted and stored, and the ruff of the burgomaster's wife, and the ruff of the cloth merchant, and the ruff of the widowed lady behind the church have all been stiffened with the pure white starch that came from the wheat, that came from the fields that lie flat under the grey sky of the Low Countries. The starch maker stands for a moment in the quiet workshop, his hands resting on the smooth wood of the bench, and he feels the calm, deep satisfaction of a day's work completed. Outside, the town carries on with its afternoon business. The voices of the merchants and the cries of the children and the distant ring of the smith's hammer blending into a soft, steady murmur that drifts across the canal and into the factory like the sound of the sea in a shell. The starch maker listens to it for a while, and then he turns to the bucket and the brush and begins the cleaning that will ready the workshop for the next batch of wheat that will come down the canal in another few days. The evening comes to the town slowly, the grey sky darkening by imperceptible degrees until the canal reflects not the pale clouds but the deeper, softer blue of the twilight, and the first lamps begin to appear in the windows of the houses along the quay. The starch maker has returned from his deliveries with the empty basket and the leather purse of coins, and now he stands in the doorway of the loading room looking out at the quiet water that has carried the barges and the grain and the hours of the day away toward the sea. The air is cooling, losing the mild warmth of the afternoon and taking on the faint, damp chill of the evening, and he pulls the loading door closed and drops the wooden latch into its iron bracket with a soft, final thud that echoes through the workshop and then fades into the silence that follows. The cleaning of the factory is a ritual that begins at the loading door and moves inward through every room in a slow, methodical progression, a sequence of small tasks that has been performed so many times that the starch maker could do it in the dark, and sometimes has when the winter evenings closed in early and the candle stub had burned down to nothing. He goes first to the dry store, where the empty burlap sacks from the morning's delivery are folded and stacked against the wall, and he checks the floor for any stray grains of wheat that may have escaped during the unloading. There are only a few, scattered near the threshold where the sacks were set down, and he sweeps them into a small pile with a hand brush made of goose feathers and drops them into a bucket that will later be emptied into the canal for the ducks. The dry store, now empty of grain, smells faintly of dust and burlap and the nutty ghost of the wheat that was there, and the starch maker closes the door and moves on. The steeping room is next, and here the cleaning is more thorough, for the barrels that held the fermenting grain must be scrubbed until they are clean and sweet and ready for the next batch. The starch maker lifts each barrel lid and peers inside, checking for any residue of the steep water that might have dried on the staves, any film of sour paste that might cling to the wood and taint the next steeping. The barrels that were used for this batch have already been scrubbed once, but he scrubs them again, taking the stiff brush and a pail of clean water and working the bristles in long, even strokes that follow the curve of the oak and reach down into the bottom where the last of the grain had rested. The water sloshes gently, a soft, rhythmic sound that fills the low room, and when the scrubbing is done he rinses each barrel with a final pail of fresh water that he pours in a steady, swirling stream. Watching the last traces of the steep wash away, and the inside of the barrel gleam and pale. The lids are left off so that the barrels can dry completely, their interiors open to the cool, moving air that will pass through the high vents during the night. He moves to the washing room, where the copper basin stands on its stout oak legs, and the settling tubs are lined up against the wall, empty now and dry. The basin is still clean from the scrubbing it received after the last batch was sieved, but he wipes it down again with a soft cloth, removing the faint patina of dust that has settled on its polished surface since the morning. The sieve frames hang on their hooks, their linen cloths loose and clean, and he checks each one by holding it up to the lantern light and peering through the weave for any sign of wear or thinning. The cloths are sound, their threads still tight and even, and he returns them to their hooks with a gentle, careful motion that does not stretch or pull the fabric. The tiled floor is swept with a wide broom that gathers the stray bits of lint and the fine white dust of dried starch that has collected in the corners, and the sweepings are dropped into the bucket with the grain. The settling room is next, a space that requires little cleaning because so little happens there, only the slow, silent sinking of the starch through the still water. The tubs are dry and clean, their interiors pale and smooth, and the starch maker checks each one for any sign of a crack in the pine planks or a loose iron strap that might need the attention of the cooper. Finding none, he wipes the rims with a damp cloth and leaves the tubs as they are, their wooden frames level and their pivots oiled with a drop of tallow that he keeps in a small pot on a shelf. The vents in the wall are open, and the cool evening air moves through the settling room in a slow, gentle current that carries the faint, clean scent of the canal and the distant smoke of the brewers' fires. The drying loft is above, and the starch maker climbs the narrow stairs with the lantern swinging at his belt, his feet finding the worn hollows in the treads without a thought. The loft is empty now, the racks bare and the trays stacked near the head of the stairs, their linen covers stripped and sent to the wash. The louvered shutters are open, and the evening sky shows through the slats in thin, pale lines of fading blue that strike the darkness of the rafters. The starch maker walks the length of the loft, his footsteps sounding hollow on the wide pine boards, and he checks the shutters one by one, closing those on the canal side where the damp night air will rise from the water, and opening those on the stable side where the air is drier. He finds a small feather on the floor near the gable, a grey pigeon feather that must have blown in through the louvers during the day, and he picks it up and puts it in his pocket. For his sister uses such feathers to stuff the small cushions that she sells to the upholsterer in the next street. The mill room and the stable yard are the last stops, and the starch maker goes out through the back door into the cool, quiet evening where the light has faded to a deep, soft grey, and the first stars are beginning to show through the thin places in the clouds. The horse is standing in the loose box, his head over the gate, his dark eyes watching the starch maker with a calm, patient attention that asks for nothing but the quiet presence of the man who has cared for him all these years. The starch maker goes to the horse and places a hand on the warm, broad forehead, feeling the coarse hair and the solid bone beneath, and the horse blows a soft breath through his nostrils that stirs the starch maker's sleeve. The water bucket is refilled from the pump. The hay rack is replenished with a fresh flake of dried grass, and a measure of oats is poured into the wooden manger, where the horse dips his soft nose and begins to eat with a slow, grinding motion of his jaw that is the last quiet sound of the day. The millstone rests on its granite bed, the great runner wheel motionless and dark, and the starch maker runs a hand over the smooth, cold surface of the stone, feeling the faint, gritty texture of the granite that has crushed so many thousands of pounds of grain that it is worn thin in the center where the wheel bears hardest. The wooden shaft that turns the wheel is greased at its bearing with a thick, dark tallow that smells of sheep and smoke, and the harness hangs on its peg near the door, the leather straps clean and supple and ready for the next time the horse will walk in his slow, patient circle. The flagstones of the mill room are swept clean of the last traces of crushed grain, and the wooden spout that carried the water to the stone is rinsed and left to dry. Back inside the main workshop, the starch maker collects the bucket of sweepings and carries it to the loading door, where he opens the lower half and pours the contents into the canal. The stray grains of wheat and the bits of chaff and the dust of the floor fall into the dark water with a soft scattered splash, and the ducks that paddle near the bridge come gliding over in the hope of food, their wakes spreading in smooth, silent lines across the surface. The starch maker watches them for a moment, the white shapes moving in the darkness, and then he closes the door and latches it. The final task is the main workshop itself, the room where the marble rolling pin rests on the granite slab and the brass balance gleams softly in its niche. He wipes the workbench with a damp cloth, removing the fine invisible dust of the starch that has settled there during the bagging, and he cleans the rolling pin with the same careful attention, rubbing the cool white marble until it glows with a soft, polished sheen. The granite slab is wiped clean, the brass weights are checked and returned to their felt-lined box, and the copper spoon is rinsed and dried and hung on its hook. The blue cloth that covered the starch bags is folded and put away in a drawer, and the empty basket is set on the floor near the door where it will wait for the next delivery day. The workshop settles into a clean, quiet order, its tools put away and its surfaces bare, and the starch maker stands for a long moment looking at the room that has been the center of his life for so many years. The lantern is blown out, its flame extinguished with a soft puff of breath that leaves the workshop in a deep, velvety darkness, broken only by the faint lines of light that creep under the doors and through the cracks in the shutters. The starch maker climbs the narrow stairs to his room under the eaves, his hand on the worn banister, his feet finding the way without need of light. The room is dark and still, the small window showing a square of deep blue sky where a few stars are now visible, and the distant sound of the town clock striking the hour comes faintly across the rooftops, a slow, measured tolling that counts out the end of the day. He undresses in the quiet darkness, folding his doublet and hanging his breeches on the peg, and he washes his face and hands one last time in the basin of cold water that he will empty in the morning. The bed is narrow and firm, the thin blanket folded back, and he lies down with a long, slow breath that releases the last of the day's quiet tensions from his shoulders and his back. The rafter above him is the same knot-shaped bird in profile, visible now only as a darker shadow against the shadow of the wood, and he looks at it for a while as his breathing slows and deepens. Outside, the canal is still and dark, its surface broken only by the faint, wavering reflection of a single lantern that hangs from a bracket on the bridge. The light trembles on the water, shifting with the slow, imperceptible movement of the current, and then it holds steady for a long, quiet moment before drifting back into stillness. The houses along the quay are dark now, their shutters closed and their doors latched, and the town settles into the deep, silent hours of the night. The factory stands at the water's edge, its bricks cooled by the evening air, its rooms clean and dark and waiting, and the starch maker closes his eyes at last, his thoughts dissolving into the quiet, wordless calm that comes before sleep, the same as every night, the same as it has been for all the nights of his life. And the canal flows slowly past in the darkness, carrying the water and the time and the days toward the sea.